Hello, this is Gumbo Craig, and this is Walking Out of Babylon, presenting the Elvis Working Part 3, The Assaults. As always, I'd like to express my appreciation for the great work on the channels of Casey Brown's Enter the Stars, Brother Theo Jackson at the Unplug 'Em channel, John Pounders, David Carrico, John and Patricia Hall at Now You See TV, Days of Noah, and Truth Unedited. As part 2 ended rather abruptly, a little recap is in order. It's September 7th, 1968. We left off just as Marlon Brando and Elvis Presley were attacked as they went to the window of Presley's Bel Air home to investigate the sounds outside of shouting and rocks pelting the side of the house. Brando is hit in the head and goes down, but is conscious and recognizes the assailants as toadies of B-movie producer Jungle Sam Katzman. Katzman has been feuding with Elvis and his manager Colonel Tom Parker since the two Presley picks helmed by Katzman, Kissin' Cousins and Harem Scarum, failed as both working experiences and at the box office. Oddly to Brando, according to the letters, the first thing they do is order Elvis to shave his beard off. Then they cut off some of his hair, placing the sheared lock in a wallet, having carefully wrapped the hair in plastic. This is either bizarre souvenir hunting or of occult significance. We will revisit this later in the series. Next, Elvis is ordered to drink a clear liquid in a small glass bottle. This makes him nauseous, but it heightens all of his senses, including pain. Brando is taken to his mansion on Mulholland Drive. He is then bound and gagged and thrown into the bongo room. He manages to get free in 3 hours. In the meantime, Elvis has been taken to a hotel where 10 henchmen have gathered to work him over, but felt their numbers were attracting too much attention, so they went back to Elvis's house. They beat him, whipped him, and burned him with cigarettes. Those who weren't torturing him went about the house, tearing things up and destroying property, ripping up his clothes, the furniture, you name it. Horrifically, Elvis is subjected to a violent gang rape and torturous sexual abuse. The assault causes him to hemorrhage, and the gangsters attempt to cauterize the wound and further torture him by sodomizing him with a hot poker from the fireplace. Very bizarrely, members of the gang withdrew Elvis's blood with a syringe and drank it. By morning, they had bound Elvis in between two brass rings on the floor of the fireplace and a large mahogany table in such a way that the more he struggled, the tighter the grip of his binding. Eventually, the assailants left, and Elvis made it to a phone to call Marlon Brando. Brando noticed the dried blood on Elvis's legs and called an ambulance. The attending physician said a police report was necessary due to the nature of the wounds, and Brando rushed to call his contacts on the police force to beg them to keep a lid on things for as long as they could. He was assured they would try, but if the reporters started asking questions, they would have to answer. The next day, in a letter to psychic counselor Carmen Montez, Brando describes Elvis as acting like a robot, tuned out completely and unaware of those around him. Although Brando's description of Elvis's injuries may be lacking in medical expertise, he relays that Elvis has kidney injuries, that he's bleeding from the kidneys and requires surgery. Also on this day, based on Brando's information, police interviewed Sam Katzman. The producer was ready in advance, apparently, and had alibis for his henchmen and witnesses to back those alibis up that everybody was just fishing in Lake Arrowhead. According to Brando, Elvis is also having trouble breathing because the inside of his nose was burned. When he later asked Elvis about this, Presley has no memory of any such thing happening. It's an example of many gaps in memory that Presley suffers in these assaults, which again is suggestive of some kind of trauma mind control or just him tuning out to what was happening to him. Marlon Brando also tells Carmen of an attempt on Elvis's life in the hospital. He says that a man dressed as an orderly tried to kill Elvis with a knife. Elvis grabbed the man, hit his own head on a cabinet door, and the man ran away just as a nurse came in. The letters in Gary Lindbergh's books also reveal that Elvis had several past traumas, possibly activated by these assaults. Both Brando and Elvis allude in separate letters to Carmen Montez to a severe 1957 beating that Elvis had that necessitates the application of makeup when Elvis films a scene in movies sometimes. No details of the incident are ever given, but the author Lindbergh sees a possible connection between the 1957 beating and Elvis taking up karate a couple of years later, achieving his first black belt in 1960. Elvis also had several phobias since childhood, which were apparently keyed by this 1968 assault. He had a fear of hands, which transferred to a fear of crowds, which often were reaching towards him, trying to touch him. He always had the feeling, since he was a kid, that hands touching him was a bad omen and that something terrible was going to happen if he was touched. Now that's kind of an odd one. Again, that to me suggests the possibility of a hypnosis or trauma-based mind control, even perhaps as a child. These phobias were also generalized into a fear of flying. All of these are possible indicators, like I said, that he was subject to hypnosis or trauma-based mind control. At 6 a.m. the next morning, in the hospital, a nurse catches Elvis preparing to stab himself with an IV needle ripped from his own arm. This was one of numerous suicide attempts by Elvis in the years after the first assault. The letters also reveal a prior suicide attempt around Halloween in 1967. Elvis tells Carmen that her astral self came to him and rescued him from despair and self-destruction. He also tells her that the letters were strong therapy for him and he don't know what he would do without them. Carmen Montez, who is a priest in the Universal Church, as well as a medium, is the only woman besides Elvis's mother that he has been able to trust completely. He says he had tried to kill himself because of months of a really miserable marriage and of constant bickering and mutual sexual infidelity between Priscilla and himself. At the time, Elvis was filming Stay Away Joe in Sedona, Arizona, which is a town rife with unclean spirits masquerading as spirit guides and often lucratively channeled these days by New Age gurus willing to be possessed for a price. In 2016, shortly before he died, Presley confidant Joe Esposito revealed that he had found a suicide note not too far from Elvis's body the day he died, and that he kept this information secret so as to spare the family. Elvis told Carmen that he often felt too undeserving and estranged from God to converse with him. And the feeling that his brain and emotions were dead caused him to undertake another suicide attempt in January of 1969. Brando suspected that Colonel Tom Parker may have taken revenge for what happened to Elvis. In the hospital, he had been very impressed with Parker's emotionalism and divulged that Parker was ready to kill those who did this to Elvis, planning to take revenge with some of the boys. Marlon Brando found Parker's emotional loyalty to Elvis touching, motivating enough to drive to Sam Catman's mansion in a rage. Sam just smirked at Brando and denied everything, accusing Elvis of being queer. Brando ended up punching Jungle Sam and getting in a fight with one of his thugs. The following day, Brando received a phone call from Marcus, one of the assailants, who tells him to keep his mouth shut or Elvis will die slowly, and that he, Brando, will be made to watch it. 6 months later, Marcus was found dead, his skull crushed in the canyon in Culver City. The cycle of violence and assault would spiral on from this point. In May 1969, perhaps in retaliation for the death of Marcus, Tom Jones and his manager Gordon Mills are abducted in Las Vegas and brought to an abandoned mine far out in the desert. Remember that Tom Jones is a very close friend of Elvis's, like Brando and like Harry Belafonte at this time period. Both are beaten and tortured, but Tom Jones is lucky enough to fall down a shaft beyond his captor's reach. However, they take their rage out on Jones's manager Gordon Mills, who was beaten severely and gang raped and ended up being hospitalized when the men escaped. Tom Jones' troubles were not nearly at an end. He received a gunshot flesh wound through the thigh while singing at a send-off party for Elvis in Palm Springs in the summer of 1969. On August 14, 1969, Tom Jones, in a letter to psychic counselor Carmen Montez, refers nervously to a knife. He also expresses apprehension about reports of a body that was found partially buried in the Nevada flats. He's nervous because the report said the man died 2 months earlier of a knife wound in the chest. Tom Jones mentions disposing of the knife somewhere between the United States and Great Britain in a place where only Davy Jones would know. But he doesn't say what he or anyone else did with that knife. No more details are expressed in the letters that we have on this mysterious topic. And I would not expect Tom Jones to be saying anything about it these days either. In that summer of 1969, Brando notices erratic behavior on Elvis's part. He eventually discovers that the sugar substitute Sucaril in Elvis's pantry has been poisoned. In the fall of 1969, a blonde girl confronts Tom Jones initially with a bouquet of flowers, then she drops to her knees and reveals that she has a razor. She's taken away by the police. She's later connected with the Charles Manson group, and incidentally, Manson's family has been suspected by some writers of being a professional hit squad. In October of 1969, on the streets of Las Vegas, 3 men confront Tom Jones, Elvis, and 2 of the Supremes, Mary Wilson and Cindy Birdsong. Mary Wilson, who was dating the married Tom Jones at this time, is slashed from her stomach to her breast. On October 20th, 1969, Tom Jones and Gordon Mills are shot at and missed while getting into a limousine. On December 2nd, 1969, Cindy Birdsong of the Supremes, is abducted from her Hollywood apartment by the custodian. On July 17, 1970, Elvis and Priscilla fly to Palm Springs. She is pregnant. At 4:20 a.m., they are awakened and assaulted by two men from Sam Katzman's gang. Elvis is forced to lie on top of his pregnant wife while he is sexually assaulted. The intruders somehow know that Priscilla is pregnant, which shocks Elvis, as this was not publicly disclosed. They tell Elvis not to move or they will kill Priscilla and cut out the baby. Priscilla ends up losing the baby later, although she and Elvis never spoke about it. Elvis figured it out. In November of 1970, Elvis discovers that a third of the bottled tooth medication he has been using for the tooth pain that has plagued him most of his life was replaced with cocaine. He had become addicted and was suffering withdrawal. There were other strange episodes in these years, 1969 to 1972. On August 28, 1969, following his last Las Vegas performance of the summer series, Elvis collapsed and was hospitalized, checked in under an assumed name. This incident shows several examples of memory blackout or loss commensurate with trauma-based mind control. Elvis woke up in the hospital not remembering how he got there. Colonel Parker was there and told him that Elvis had been ripping the needle out of his arm and refusing to eat. Subsequently, Elvis fled the hospital. Another incident he has no memory of, and wakes up 3 days later in Nancy Sinatra's room at the International Hotel in Las Vegas, where she was playing. Nancy Sinatra has been pursuing Elvis for years very aggressively. When Elvis comes to consciousness, Nancy is shaving him, and again, he has no memory of how he left the hospital or how he got there. He is also in a state of paranoia and had her drive him to Los Angeles. She says that during those 3 days that he does not remember, the two of them had very, as she put it, amorous sex. She says during those 3 days that he does not remember the two of them doing this at all. The next thing he knows, he ends up at Marlon Brando's. Again, he cannot remember how. The next month, September 1969, is when Brando discovered that the sucral sugar substitute in Elvis's pantry is poisoned. Brando mentions to Carmen in a letter that if Elvis died from this, everyone would think that his suicide attempts had finally succeeded. Brando also says that it was the Colonel who had suggested Elvis start using this sugar substitute to keep his weight down. Marlon Brando's letters to psychic Carmen Montez also reveals that mutual friend Tom Jones has done some investigation and found out that Colonel Parker was in deep financial trouble and that he needs a great deal of money in the next 6 months and plans to get it from Elvis and or work him nearly to death. This letter also refers to Vernon as Elvis's uncle. This is Tom Jones referring to Vernon as Elvis's uncle. Brando mentions that Elvis sleeps very little and talks in his sleep and moves around quite a bit when he does. He has even woke up screaming, swearing that there was a man in a dark cloak with a noose standing by his bed. Here, Brando also mentions his concern over a bizarre Elvis double that he thinks is going around causing trouble and making people think he is Elvis. Brando thinks that this double has even fooled Priscilla and gotten her pregnant. Brando sees this Elvis double modeling the famous nudie suit design Western wear on Art Linkletter's TV show, and Carl Linkletter, a man with a lot of very interesting connections himself, we'll mention sometime. And Linkletter gives him the man's name, which is Ronnie Bissett. Brando thinks that Colonel Tom Parker groomed this Elvis double. Details are in Gary Lindbergh's 2 books on the Elvis letters, which I highly recommend them, as well as Lindbergh's book on Elvis's family roots. In 1972, 3 men and a young woman attempted to murder Elvis in Los Angeles. The 3 break into his house and subdue Elvis, tying him by the hands and throat with rawhide. They wet the rawhide so that it slowly shrinks and will choke Elvis to death, and they leave. Before blocking out, Elvis sees Colonel Parker there. Parker is trying to stop the homicide, saying he's sorry that he started the whole mess. The 3 male attackers included a well-known major stockbroker, the son of Loretta Young's ex-husband, and a member of the prominent Vandekamp restaurant family. Very strange to have such a crime being perpetrated by wealthy and presumed upright members of society. Again, to me, this indicates secret society involvement and the controller's involvement in this. Elvis later confronts Colonel Parker, who starts crying and saying, "Oh, well, I thought that you wanted to die and I needed the money." Elvis even ends up giving Parker the money that he needed to get out of a jam. It was often said that Elvis was incapable of cutting even toxic people out of his life. The letters from Elvis and others to Carmen drop off in late 1970. There are few in 1971-72. It seems that everyone just moved on. Elvis became a fixture in Las Vegas. Tom Jones had a successful television show. Marlon Brando's career was revived by The Godfather, and Harry Belafonte became more deeply involved with the civil rights movement and other causes. The letters clearly demonstrate that there is a secret Hollywood behind the one we normally see. This Hollywood is under the direction and/or inspiration of the enemy, the controllers, those in league with the forces of darkness. And it seeks to shape our minds in a counter-Christ direction, aiming to steal our salvation and misdirect our lives. In this sense, Elvis was a victim to these dark forces, as well as his own willful ignorance and missteps in the spiritual path. That was so important to him, this spiritual path was, but it was also influenced by some very dangerous apostate thinking, a lot of New Age and magical influences around him, in the person of his, particularly his hairdresser, Larry Geller, whose 2 books on Elvis we'll also be talking about when we do the segment on Elvis's metaphysical and mystical and occult beliefs. In the final analysis, Elvis kept on doing what he thought provided joy for his fans, even though his personal life was full of fear. His marriage was disastrous and filled with fighting and infidelity by both partners, I said, and until it ended after a few short years. Well, that's all for today. I think I've got another 7 minutes or so of pictures that'll be rolling by if you want to see them. I thank you for your time, and we'll see you again soon. This is Gumbo Craig with Walking Out of Babylon. All glory to the Most High God.